Hello and welcome to Policing TV and this edition of Talking Crime with me, Danny Shaw. I've been a journalist for over 30 years covering policing, criminal justice and the law, and I'll try to bring some of my experiences to bear in this series of discussions where we get to the heart of the key issues surrounding crime. My guest is Mike Barton, a former Chief Constable with a reputation for innovation, evidence-based policing and plain speaking. Welcome to the show, Mike.
Good to see you, Danny.
Mike, I want to ask you about the situation that we find ourselves in at the moment, this extraordinary situation where people in Downing Street in Whitehall, the Prime Minister, his advisors and others are at the centre of this police investigation about whether they broke COVID-19 regulations. I mean, did you ever anticipate at the start of the pandemic back in March 2020 that we find ourselves in this incredible situation that we find ourselves in now?
No, I don't think anybody did, Dee. It's a dreadful state of affairs. I mean, I've got to say, I was very concerned at the start of the pandemic when there was a lot of sabre rattling about the police being the enforcement arm of the new social rules governing how we live our lives to curb the pandemic. I was concerned because we'd never seen restrictions like that in peacetime in the UK, and we're not used to them. And I was worried about the impact it would have on policing because we police by consent in the UK. And policing by consent, the cornerstone of policing by consent is that the public have to have confidence in the police, that it's public confidence is not a nice to have for British policing, it's utterly essential. It's that basic keystone in the whole edifice. So, what's really worrying, not only surprising, because it seems to have been going on all the way through the rules changing, what's really worrying is that this cuts to the heart of public confidence. So it's crucial, in my mind, that the police do actually investigate this, because if they don't, then the public will see it as one law for them and one law for the people in power who've actually described the laws in the first place. So it's absolutely crucial that there's investigation. By the way, investigations don't have to lead to a prosecution. The two should be seen as separate, but I think there should be an investigation simply to find out what the devil's been going on.
The position that the Metropolitan Police put out was that they didn't do retrospective investigations into alleged COVID-19 breaches because, of course, what we're dealing with here is pretty low-level offences. The most really that someone is going to get is a penalty fine. And they made that position pretty clear. It's just summary offences. Now, if you were the Chief Constable and someone came to you, let's say 6 months afterwards, and said, my neighbour, I saw him driving with a phone at the wheel of his car, or he was, committing a minor traffic offence that would incur a penalty fine. I mean, what would you, as a chief constable, do? Would you launch an investigation so many months down the line?
Depends who's done it. Low level offending isn't about the offence, it's who does it and in what circumstances. And if the people who've actually set these rules have clearly broken them, then that sets it apart. It's not low level offending, it's high level offending, and it's highly offensive as well. So why do I not agree that you should not investigate? You should have a blanket rule that you don't investigate historically these rules. I absolutely agree that the rules were brought in to deal with the here and now. They were there as a deterrent so that people didn't go about their everyday business and spread COVID-19. So these were a defensive measure so that people didn't do that. So if people didn't follow the rules, then the rules themselves were going to be ineffective because we're actually dealing with a public health issue here. which is why what makes it novel. So it's crucial that people follow the rules at the time. So I can sympathise with the view that there's no point investigating things 6, 7, 8 months in history, because it's not going to actually deal with the here and now. But it is if it's a cause célèbre like we're looking at. So if it's a cause célèbre that's captured the zeitgeist, the public imagination, then that's precisely what the police should deal with, because you've got to actually make sure that the public have confidence in the rules and that the rules are being applied evenly and fairly. So if the people who set the rules break the rules, then I think those should be investigated retrospectively. People who are in the public eye, who've got a duty to actually set an example. And also, you don't want there to become a situation where the public feel that it's one law for them and one law for the people who are setting the rules. And of course, the rules are there to be investigated retrospectively. So albeit these are summary offences, so normally we would only have 6 months to investigate, Parliament has actually said you've got 3 years and it's 6 months from you finding out that the offences took place. So there's plenty of wriggle room for these things to be investigated.
So you don't think it sets a precedent in as much as anyone could come forward, let's say, and say that, well, my neighbour had a party back in April 2020 or December 2021 and demand that you launch a police investigation. And you would say, well, no, we're not going to do that. And they would say, well, you're doing it for the people in Downing Street.
Yeah, I mean, it's a fair question, I suppose,
I
Danny,
mean
but I think,
that you is because what you're doing is you're sort of setting apart a
yes,
group
I
of
am,
people
but
from
no,
other
I am
people. I
setting
thought
them
the law
apart.
has to be consistent, doesn't it?
No, certainly in my 40 years involved in policing, there's plenty of wrinkles in the law. I mean, very few offences are actually detected. So there are plenty of wrinkles there where if you commit a burglary and the police don't investigate it, then that's unfair, isn't it? There's loads of unfairness in the law, and it is not a defence to say I've been prosecuted and other people haven't. Or um, I've made it clear, if it's a cause célèbre, if it undermines public confidence, it's a critical incident. There's a definition, it's widely accepted in policing, the definition of critical incident. This is a critical incident for the Metropolitan Police and for the whole of policing, because people don't differentiate between the Metropolitan Police and their local police force. And certainly when Dominic Cummings was taking his unusual eyesight tests in County Durham, then I know from speaking to my former colleagues that the Dominic Cummings factor was brought up by everybody. And they didn't differentiate to say that it's quite right, you must not investigate Dominic Cummings historically, retrospectively. What they actually said was, well, if it's all right for Dominic Cummings, why are you taking issue with me? So, in which cuts to the heart of the issue that Dominic Cummings, doing what he did, undermined the rules. And certainly what's been happening in Westminster, seemingly for the last 2 years, is certainly going to undermine those rules. And if I may say so, and I don't think I'm going off piste here, I thought the um, gymnastics, the sophistry and verbal gymnastics that some of the ministers got up to when they were trying to defend the indefensible conduct of Dominic Cummings was worse than what Dominic Cummings did himself. And I actually think the sophistry and ridiculous uh, non-defences that are being put up for parties, and if it was only 10 minutes or it was only 5 minutes and I only popped in and it obviously wasn't a party until it was pointed out to me, it's all plainly bringing all of the edifice of the law into disrepute. And certainly if I were a chief constable involved in this, I would be even-handed, but I would be really clear, and I would be giving my gimlet eye to people in public positions to make sure that they actually conform to the rules. And if they didn't, well, woe betide them.
So, talking of leadership, can I ask you about that? And you've talked about the importance of setting an example, setting a culture, standards, and so on. How do you go about that? You were the Chief Constable of Durham Police. What does that actually entail?
Well, the first thing is you be yourself. And you certainly don't set yourself up as some sort of plaster saint. So I never ever told people that I was perfect, because number one, it's untrue, and number two, they would have seen through it very quickly. So I think what you've got to be is authentic, and you've got to. I mean, certainly, I sort of take a very British approach to leadership, and I actually think humour is that central spine of how we should operate as leaders, particularly self-deprecation. So I quite like that, and I don't know whether that's a northern thing or a policing thing, but it was certainly authentic to me. And I suppose I was taught that by my bosses and my family, when I was growing up, don't take yourself too seriously. So that's the first thing, because people have got to like you, um, but also people have got to respect you. And I think that's the hard bit for leadership, because you've got to balance the liking and the respect, and you can't always be liked, and that's where respect takes over. So if I knew I'd done something wrong or stepped out of line or fallen short of probably what I would have expected of myself at the start of the day, then you fall on your sword really quickly. Um, and and you deal with whatever that is, and you write a letter of apology, or you make a, but you don't do one of those false apologies that we've seen an awful lot of recently. So I think that's the first thing. I think the other thing is what you ignore, what you walk past, you becomes your standard. And you have to be too picky here, but if I can pick on something that people would see as quite inane and unimportant, litter. I never walked past litter, and I never did as a police officer, and I never did as a boss. If I went to a police station, and I regularly visited all our police stations, if there was litter, I would pick it up. And if there was a lot of litter, I would knock on the door, tell them to put the kettle on, and then give me a bag, and I would pick it all up. And then they'd say something like, "Oh, don't," because I knew what I was doing. "Oh, don't bother picking it up, boss. We were picking it up just yesterday or the day before." I said, "Well, I can carbon date some of this litter, so don't start telling me that you've been picking it up recently." And I would do that. And there was one case where behind headquarters, Smokers Alley, we had somebody came in to complain, a rambler, to say that there were hundreds of cigarette ends. And I went to have a look, and it was appalling. And we'd given them smokers bins, but they couldn't be bothered to use them. So I actually went out and with a colleague, and we picked up over 1,000 dog ends. And then I wrote a letter and I attached it to the back door of the headquarters, telling people that I'd picked up over 1,000 dog ends. I wasn't going to do it anymore. I expected them to use the facilities that were there, and it was embarrassing for me and the organisation. And I think it's those little things where you don't ignore things that set the standard. So, but I think it's got to be. I'm picking on something there where it was a bit of a finger wag, but there's something else. So every time I met somebody, I tried to remember a story about them, and so we could have a conversation with them about the story. And I wanted those stories to be the good things that they were doing to protect the public, evidence-based policing or problem-oriented policing initiatives, and we're. I think we're wired as human beings to have really good memories about stories. So if you think about it, there's been what, 7,500 generations of human being, Homo sapiens, and only for about 10 generations at most have we been, have we read and we've been literate. Uh, Before that, it was all a spoken history. Um, the I'm going to tell you this story because I think it's absolutely fascinating. I went to Australia to talk about drugs in Perth. They invited me across there to a conference, and so I learnt a lot about Aboriginal culture. And there'd been a furore that there's an island off the coast of Perth, right in the middle of the ocean, and there was the Aboriginal people when white settlers arrived said that they'd actually walked to that island, and it was poo-pooed as myth because there's no way you can walk to that island. It's in the middle of the Pacific, and yet only recently they've worked out that 35,000 years ago you could actually walk to that island. So the Aboriginal memory, the stories that were handed down from ancestors had lasted 35,000 years. Well, we can't even remember what happened 200 years ago. So that's the value of oral culture. So when you're in leadership positions, tell stories and allow stories to be told and to be celebrated. And that's what you do, Danny. I mean, you've spent your entire life as a journalist. That's why I think the journalistic tradition is something that's absolutely vital to us.
Well, some fascinating ideas there, Mike, about leadership. And you mentioned drugs, and I wanted to ask you about drugs policy because if you Google your name, one of the things that comes up quite quickly is Mike Barton and his so-called liberal policy on drugs. And so I want to be absolutely clear about this. What is your current position around drugs legalization and the current drug laws that we have at the moment?
Well, I don't agree with the words of legalization, decriminalization, or anything like that. I think they should be regulated differently. They're already regulated. I just want them to be regulated differently. So if we talk about legalization, it means simply, oh, well, they're illegal and we're going to make them legal. If it's decriminalization, these people used to be arrested and sent to prison and they're not going to be now. And it's not like that. It's like most things in life, it's a bit more complicated. Alcohol is illegal. Heroin is legal. Alcohol is illegal if a 5-year-old goes into an off license and tries to buy it. Heroin is legal if you're giving it to an elderly relative who needs palliative care in a care home and prescribed by a doctor. Tobacco is illegal. Cocaine is legal in different circumstances. So, and all I'm saying is Class A drugs, the classic drugs that are driving most of the criminality in this country and allowing people, bad people, to control whole areas of this country, should be regulated in a different way so we don't hand over billions of pounds to criminal enterprises and destroy countries. That's what I'm saying. So if somebody's addicted to something, that should not be a criminal justice matter because criminal justice can never solve addiction. The only thing that can solve addiction is psychological therapy and other medical interventions and social interventions. The law cannot do that. So, well, we can send them to prison, then they can't have drugs. Well, that's a joke, isn't it? Because people can get access to drugs in prison. And frankly, a lot of the regimes in prison are actually controlled by criminal gangs who use it to gather more money. So for me, they should be regulated differently. So, for example, if somebody's addicted to heroin, we should give them heroin as their therapy. We give them methadone because we think that, oh, well, methadone sounds like a drug. Methadone was developed by pharmaceutical companies over in California 20 or 30 years ago, became the drug of choice because there's plenty of profit into it. But the British government have paid for many tests of this, and I was involved in a couple when I was Chief Constable up in Durham. And the Lancet have published the results of these trials. They're called RIOT or RIO, randomized injecting opiate trials. And what they do three things. So they test that lots of people injecting heroin, injecting methadone, oral methadone. Now, of those three groups, the injecting heroin group are healthier, come off drugs quicker, and commit less crime. And then at the end of it all, we start giving people oral methadone again. After the taxpayer has paid for all of that trial. So why do we keep doing that? So I'm not liberal, I'm just sensible. And people who say that I'm liberal imply that they're tough and draconian. There's nothing tough about what we're doing now. It's just stupid. So at the moment, we have got the worst addiction in the UK, in the whole of Europe. When I joined policing 40 years ago, Afghanistan was producing about 90 tons of opium a year. 9,900 tons a year now. And we've got fewer cops dealing with drugs. We've got exactly the same mechanism, the Misuse of Drugs Act 1971, where all we're using is the same failed regime that has created the problem that we've currently got. So I don't think I'm liberal, I think I'm sensible, and I think the people who promote what we currently do are just stupid. And there must be something in the water in Westminster, you know, Danny. This is one of my theories. David Cameron, when he was leader of the opposition, we're going to do something about this. The drugs laws are ridiculous. And as soon as he became prime minister, and I gave him the opportunity because I publicly said that we should be doing something about this. I thought I was going to get a bit of traction because I was known then as a tough, plain-speaking cop, and we were running a pretty decent outfit up in Durham. And I suggested all this, and he actually went on live telly. It coincided with the Conservative Party conference, saying that I was some sort of nincompoop. And it's really worrying. There must be some civil servants or mythical being in the middle of Westminster that wants us to cling on to something that isn't working.
So you mentioned that there's some sort of blockage in the system. Is it not so much at the fact that there may be a civil servant in government who's blocking it, but that politicians are worried about voter reaction? They're worried about the fact that any loosening of the laws or loosening of the way that police approach drugs enforcement, particularly in relation to Class A drugs such as cocaine, heroin, is not going to go down well amongst most members of the public. Isn't that is what the root of the problem is, isn't it?
But that's a myth, isn't it? Because when I first came out publicly in Durham, the Northern Echo, it's still going, a great paper, conducted a plebiscite. They asked the public what they thought, and there was actually it was pretty even. There was a majority on cannabis, but it was pretty even on heroin. So even though I was at that cutting edge of what should we do differently, it was still pretty evenly split. And that's the problem, isn't it? If we're going to say the public think this, well, no wonder the public think this, because they're fed a diet of tripe when it comes to what works. We've proved, one of the reasons why I like evidence-based policing, and I wanted to be much more scientific when I became chief, was I wanted to prove whether things worked or not. So that's why we started to take a scientific approach. That's why medicine has made so many advances in the last 200 years, is because they take a scientific evidence-based approach. Doctors didn't used to wash their hands So, and this is where it all started from. Midwives. So there were less mums dying and babies dying when midwives dealt with the birth than when male doctors did. And they proved it was because male doctors didn't wash their hands. So just basic hygiene, but that was done through trials and science. And it's exactly the same in policing. So this is what we proved in Durham through Operation Checkpoint. We started dealing with people instead of prosecuting them. We started giving them an opportunity to change the way that they lived their lives. So we were dealing with we were trying to reduce the reoffending rates, which is really what we want. We don't want offending in the future. And with Operation Checkpoint, by not prosecuting people, including drug dealers, we demonstrated that you can actually reduce the reoffending rate by 30%. And it's out there by sitting down and really being tough with offenders. So insisting that restorative justice is at the centre of all this, because a lot of offenders actually offend against their family. They steal from their family before they start stealing from the community. So an awful lot of drug dealers, by the time that they've finally reached rock bottom, they've lost all the family, all the friends, all their social media. And we all know, because it's been proven time and time again, that it's the support of family and strong social ties that actually are most beneficial for reducing reoffending rates. So we demonstrated it, and it's still going strong, Operation Checkpoint. So if anybody tells me that I'm daft and liberal, then I said, well, actually, I'm scientific. We proved it to be true. And it's tougher to get people to face their addiction than simply to go through the revolving door and send them to prison again.
Do you see any signs of hope around your ideas about drugs? Are any of your ideas and projects being taken on board anywhere? I mean, I know we talked about the checkpoint scheme. Some other police forces are adopting similar projects. But for example, you will have seen the recent furore in London when it was suggested that certain people suspected of carrying drugs were going to be treated differently and sort of sent on diversion courses, and the row that caused, the newspaper headlines. Do you see any signs of change around this, or is the approach going to change at all?
I think I'm more of a pessimist on this than an optimist, Danny. Um, um, the law doesn't need to change for policing to change. If you speak to the academics and the medics, they actually say the only people who are being sensible about all this are generally the cops, generally the police. So the way that many police forces and a lot of police forces liked Checkpoint because we demonstrated that it worked through Cambridge University. So it was demonstrable, it was evidence based. So you couldn't argue with it. By all means, do it and test it, and that's how we develop knowledge, isn't it? Because it may not be perfect. So we actually worked on Turning Point. So Turning Point, you've got a navigator. So that the concept of navigator is key to Checkpoint, and that's a person who's not a cop, but a drugs worker, a teacher, a social worker who sits down, usually has about 30 clients at any one time, and they work with them for 4 months. So they've got about 30 clients, and they actually sit down with them and make sure that there's an agreement there signed with me as chief then, and now with Joe as the current chief, where they agree that they're going to do 4 or 5 things in their private life that are going to change, they reduce their reoffending rates. So the navigator's key because they're their sort of mentor, muse, guide, uh, so to speak. And what Turning Point did, they had cops as their navigators, and it looked like the cops were the problem. So we don't have any cops as navigators, and our results were phenomenally good. So I'm sure if other people, and I know they have, over half of police forces took up the concept of Checkpoint as a result of reading what we've done. I want them to fiddle with it and test it and test it into to see whether it can be improved upon, or there may be circumstances where it doesn't work. So, for example, we proved that it's really hard to turn around young men in their 20s. They seem to be a real particular problem with us on checkpoint, that we had less success with them than with other cohorts. And I'm sure there's something that we weren't doing right with them that other people could test. So I'm upbeat that there's a lot more police chiefs talking about evidence-based policing, but I'm not upbeat that there's a lot of courage out there to do the things that are challenging um, the current thinking. And one of the reasons why I'm a bit pessimistic is because of the concept of police and crime commissioners. I don't think they're a good idea. I can see that if they were to be the elected chairman of a police authority, that would work. But to give this person um, complete control of policing when they win 50%, 51% of a vote, when sometimes there's only 15 or 16% of people um, uh,
Turning out. Yeah.
vote in the actual election. So you've got this person who's been elected by 10% of local people, who then says, I've now got a mandate to do this, that, and the other, whatever it is. And you see, I've heard some dreadful examples of police and crime commissioners coming out with utter rot. And of course, because the party political, which is a dreadful state of affairs, you get, sadly, a lot of police and crime commissioners, sometimes defending the indefensible when it's coming from the government. So I do have sympathy with some of my former colleagues who've got particularly dim-witted police and crime commissioners who are stopping them doing sensible things. I mean, they are in the minority. Most police and crime commissioners are trying their best, but the concept of giving somebody who's untrained and doesn't know anything about policing coming in and having the run of the place just fills me with dread.
Mike, we're going to draw this to a close in a minute, but you've given us lots of food for thought about police and crime commissioners. You'd like to see them scrapped. You want to see a bit of bolder thinking around drugs. You've given us some ideas about good leadership. Is there any other one major change you would like to see that you think will make policing better or improve the criminal justice system before we have to end this discussion?
I'd give all police officers a compassion pill. And the way to do that is to insist that all of them learn about restorative justice and apply it. So restorative justice is the system of social control in any First Nation or Aboriginal country. It was our system in Anglo-Saxon times before we got the punitive state-run criminal justice system that we have now, where punishment is handed out rather than dealing with the harm that's been caused to individuals or society. So there's an awful lot of police officers who think now, and sadly a lot more will think that now, because they've been given such draconian powers over the last 2 years during the pandemic, telling people that they can't go outside and issuing fixed penalty tickets because 2 people are sat in the car. I worry that we've inadvertently walked away from policing by consent and being empathetic and sympathetic to the community. The police can't possibly enforce the law themselves. The law's got to be followed by the people with the help of policing. And that's what restorative justice is all about. So I would advocate all chief constables who worry about the culture that there may be in parts of their police force to think about teaching their people. And we are aiming to be a profession where we want to be all degree level. So we've got smart people who can understand these concepts but I speak to many police officers, and some of them don't even know what it is. And I think that's a great tragedy.
Mike Barton, thank you very much for joining us on Policing TV and Talking Crime. It's been the most fascinating discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you.